At the end of September, Imre and I went to visit my mother in Wisconsin. I should tell you that in her youth, my mother, in addition to being a strikingly beautiful woman, was strong, witty, and very resilient. But time takes its toll, and in the last couple of years she'd suffered 2 bad falls and 3 small strokes, resulting in increasing difficulties, both physical and cognitive. After a month or so of repeated trips to the emergency room and a great deal of disorientation, her doctor determined that it was time for her to have round-the-clock medical care available. My older sister, Carol, began to investigate assisted living. The facility she found in Madison pleased our mother for the first day or 2, but when it registered that the move was not just temporary, she began to find it unacceptable. Her manner of expressing her dissatisfaction became, rather rapidly, extreme. She'd inhale agitatedly and then scream, "I gotta get out of here." She could acknowledge that the building was clean and attractive, the staff professional and kind, but the other tenants struck her as either, in her own words, loonies or morbidly depressing old geezers. Needless to say, these are objectionable terms, and the irony didn't escape us that they were the very objectionable terms that somebody else might hurl at our mother at this stage of her life. That didn't mean we didn't feel for her. It was a very distressing situation, as it surely was for the other residents as well. As they say, getting old is not for sissies. The one thing that seemed to appease our mother was the possibility of escaping for the brief outings that my sister could offer her when she could make the nearly 3-hour drive from her home in Two Rivers, a hamlet in the northern part of the state, on the shores of Lake Michigan. But given the distance and my sister's work schedule, these opportunities were relatively few and far between. And since I was even further away and didn't have a driver's license, I was of even less help. My sister broached the possibility of moving our mother up near her, where the facilities were both more spacious and more affordable. Of course, the biggest selling point would be her own proximity. I'd investigated the possibilities in New York, but as you can imagine, those were very cramped and ridiculously expensive. Plus, our mother is hugely freaked out by city street noise. I was very grateful to my sister for her willingness to take on the lion's share of support, and I told her so. At certain moments, our mother also seemed to appreciate Carol's big-heartedness, but she was also extremely pissed off about the general situation, losing her independence, being forced out of her home, and she had some serious doubts about moving to the northern part of the state. Madison, as you may know, is considered by many to be both a cultural and political oasis in the state. Our mother moved there when she was married to our father, who taught at the university. Although they divorced in 1967, and although she went on to have a successful career of her own in business, she still considers her real calling to be that of a faculty wife, specifically somebody at home in a university town, an urbane, elegant, left-leaning, bookish woman who could mix a mean vodka gimlet. Madison suited her. Two Rivers, by contrast, is an old manufacturing town, better known for deer hunting, salmon fishing, miniature bowling, jello shots, and impassioned right-wing politics. I confess that I share some of my mother's hoity-toity inclinations. When I tell people I was born in Madison, I often add, birthplace of Gina Rowlands, as though all of us born there were destined to be the sultry, brainy muses of a genius of American independent cinema. Two Rivers, by contrast, was the birthplace of Lydia Clark, the B-movie actress better known as the widow of Charlton Heston. You get the picture. Despite the fact that my sister had been living in Two Rivers for 20 years, I'd never been there to visit. She'd also never been to New York. Maybe you wonder how she ended up there, or how I ended up here. Growing up, we weren't exactly what you'd call close. She was 5 years older, and traffic-stoppingly beautiful, with piercing light blue eyes, thick brown hair, and, despite her slenderness, improbably, in fact, seemingly impossibly, large, perfect breasts. She snuck cigarettes and dated bad boys. I reported her infractions. I was pale, skinny, and a pain-in-the-ass goody-two-shoes. She let me know not only that, but also that my eyes were too far apart, my eyebrows bushy, and when I started to sprout hair in my armpits, she informed me that I was gross. Looking back with some objectivity, I think I probably was not really gross, but she was right about the pain-in-the-ass goody-two-shoes thing. Even our mother concurred with her on that. In our youth, she and my sister often had those typical shouting matches with slamming doors and so on, but when I consistently and simperingly did exactly as I was told, our mother would roll her eyes and call me saccharine. She herself was always on the saltier side. Anyway, part of my sister's rebellion included dropping out of the UW after a semester, marrying a pool shark at 18, and becoming a Republican. The marriage eventually dissolved, but the party affiliation stuck. Later, she and her son moved in with her new boyfriend, Mark, a warm, handsome outdoorsman type, and the three of them relocated north. Our contact over all these years had been sporadic, always over holiday meals at our mother's place. I tended to avoid talking about politics when my sister was around. She had the surely healthier attitude of forthrightly and unapologetically spouting her opinions. As I said, our mom's a lefty, so she's a bit befuddled by my sister's views. But to be fair, she's probably equally disconcerted by a few of my own lifestyle decisions, like wardrobe choices or questions of sexual discretion. Plus, as I said, she finds New York a little overwhelming. So, all things considered, moving our mother to Two Rivers seemed to be clearly the best option, and despite our mom's concern about the political and intellectual class of people up there, she finally caved in. It took a few weeks for Carol to set things up, but when she had a move-in date, Imre and I got our tickets so we could be there when she was settling in. I was really touched that Imre wanted to go, but he kept assuring me that Two Rivers sounded right up his alley. He'd already been to Madison, where he gamely played the role of Mom's smoking buddy when Carol wasn't around to do that. But when I told him about Two Rivers, he began to fantasize about a kind of Wild West scenario. Imre has had a cowboy fascination since early childhood. In fact, when he'd shown me the photo albums of his youth, it appeared that gunslinging was the main thematic. He realized there was a difference between the Midwest and the Wild West, but this sounded like a pretty good approximation. In anticipation of our visit, my sister kept texting me apologetically, saying Imre might have a little culture shock in podunk. She said the main activity there was drinking. The motto is, you gotta have two livers to live in Two Rivers, and the town's claim to fame was being the birthplace of the ice cream sundae. She wasn't sure my fancy French lover was going to find the place up to snuff, but I told her, you had us at ice cream and booze. She said, we also have sausage and cheese. I said, according to Imre, those are the 4 major food groups. Seriously, when I told him about this exchange, he could hardly contain himself. I should mention that there's perhaps one other reason Imre was inclined to accompany me on this trip. If you've been following our saga, this will perhaps be obvious to you. It had been almost exactly 1 year since Imre had lost his own mother, Lily. He knew what it meant to care for a parent late in life. That's not just to say that he wanted to be supportive of me, or even of me and my sister. I think he really wanted to spend some time with our mother. Imre loves old people. He finds time with them very precious. Well, the most efficient way to get from New York to Two Rivers is to fly into Milwaukee and take a 2-hour shuttle van north. We flew on a rinky-dink airline called Wisconsin Air, and then hopped on the shuttle. Imre nodded off during the drive, but I stared out the window and looked at the names of the small towns. There was a Fredonia, just like in the Marx Brothers movie, which was weird because we'd also been to Fredonia, New York on one of our early tours. There was also a town called Random Lake, which struck me funny. We pulled into the lot of the Cool City Motel where we'd booked a room and noted that they already had their Halloween decorations up. Cool City may make Two Rivers sound like a happening little burg, but apparently it's just literal. It's fucking cold there in the winter. The check-in was the old-fashioned kind. We had to show ID and sign into a register. There was a taxidermied fish on the wall. We liked our room. It was a kitchenette with a hot plate and a stash of instant coffee. The artwork, all fish-related, was slightly askew. There was an ashtray, but there was a notice on the door explaining that guests would be fined for careless smoking habits leading to the damage of any bedding or furniture. Maybe on account of the power of suggestion, Imre almost immediately knocked an ash onto our synthetic bedspread, burning a pretty ghastly little hole in it. He managed to remake the bed, however, in such a way that the burn was concealed. After we'd settled in, we made calls to my mother and my sister and agreed to meet them in the morning and tour some local sites. There were 2 historical institutions of note, the Hamilton Wood-Type Museum and the Ice Cream Museum. We decided to hit the wood-type one first. It was an open, airy place with knowledgeable volunteer docents eager to fill us in. J.E. Hamilton founded his wood-type manufacturing company in 1880, and, as the saying goes, that put Two Rivers on the map. According to this museum, virtually all the wood type used in this country at the end of the 19th century was made by Hamilton. But as printing technology changed, of course the company had to diversify. They merged with some outfit called Fisher Industries and started making laboratory equipment until, about 12 years ago, as the company website tells you, Fisher Hamilton built a next-generation manufacturing plant in Reynosa, Mexico. This facility, the company explains, allowed Fisher Hamilton to compete in the new global economy. This was not, needless to say, a popular move amongst the locals. The former Fisher Hamilton factory has since been razed. I found some images online of the general site's destruction, but evidently the really symbolic act was the demolition of the ancient Hamilton smokestack, which just happened last year. The whole town gathered across the river to watch the final blow. Everybody and his brother appears to have posted video of that event. Please excuse the all too obvious phallic imagery. So, it won't surprise you to know that there's some resentment in Two Rivers regarding that new global economy. That may also explain a certain tendency toward nostalgia. I probably don't need to tell you which way the town voted in the recent presidential elections. When we watched the returns coming in and we noted that Wisconsin had turned out to be a red state, Imre was somewhat mystified since for him, and actually for most of the world historically, red has always signified leftist or even specifically communist orientation. But for nearly 30 years, let's face it, the economic politics of the so-called left and the right have been increasingly difficult to distinguish from one another throughout much of the world, including France and the U.S. So looking at those political maps was pretty confusing. Also, did I mention this? Imre's colorblind. Are you wondering about the food in Two Rivers? Well, in addition to those basic food groups I mentioned, there's also a sizable Mexican restaurant, which seems to fill up with locals, notwithstanding whatever resentment there may be about the Fisher-Hamilton move to Reynosa. The burritos at this place might be best described as ginormous. Ditto for the margaritas, which were neon green. Believe it or not, that's a small one that my mom is hoisting in this photo. We went there after our visit to the Wood-Type Museum. And the following day, we checked out the other food groups. Sausage and cheese were represented at a spot known for its bratwurst. Perhaps you know, the brat is a Wisconsin staple. When the waitress asked what kind of side I wanted with that, I said, "What have you got that's green?" She said, "Nothing." But when I scoured the menu, I discovered a little item called cheesy broccoli bites. Basically, they boil the hell out of a miniature butt of brock, stir it into some melted mild cheddar, and make little balls of that to cook in the deep fryer. The brats, I must say, were fairly delicious. We also hit the Ice Cream Museum. I realize there may be another town or two that wants to lay claim to the invention of the sundae, but Two Rivers makes a pretty convincing case for itself. The ice cream parlor that houses the museum is uncanny. It's like one of those Twilight Zone episodes in which you walk into the distant past. The prices seemed weirdly reasonable, maybe in part because it was staffed, like the Woodtype Museum, by volunteer retirees. After eating our sundaes, we explored the rest of the place, which was full of historical relics, old dolls and dollhouses, musical instruments, hats and hairnets, military rations, dental and medical equipment, Hummel figurines, ashtrays, and cardboard cutouts of old-timers. I took a picture of Imre having a frosty cardboard beer with some turn-of-the-century barfly. There were photos of some former popular music groups, including the Schmidt Brothers and a girl group known as the Cool City Airs. There were also plenty of photos of Lydia Clark, both prior and subsequent to her marriage to Charlton Heston. There was also, for no obvious reason, an old magazine with John Wayne on the cover. That was funny because shortly after we'd arrived in Two Rivers, Imre had written his friend Gregory that in this town all the men look like John Wayne and the women look like John Wayne. He didn't mean that in a bad way. He likes weathered faces, and in truth the weather probably has something to do with the rugged good looks of the men and women there, but probably so do whiskey and cigarettes. Which brings me to our last stop of the day. After we dropped our mom off at her new place, Carol and Mark invited me and Imre for a round of miniature bowling at a local bar called Tippy's. It's a narrow establishment sporting plenty of Green Bay Packers decorations. In the far back, there's actually a smoker's lounge with a ventilator and a TV screen for those who can't miss a play to go outside for a quick cigarette. We checked that out and then tried our hand at miniature bowling. Frankly, we all kind of sucked, but it may have been the Crown Royal whiskey. Carol takes hers with Diet Coke, but Imre and I took ours neat. You know, neither of us is a big sporting type, neither as a spectator nor as a participant, but we experienced a weird pleasure that night at Tippy's with my sister and her partner, drunkenly hurling those balls at the triangle of defenseless little pins. I think we were all aware that we're not exactly on the same side on a number of issues, but that night, in the blurry haze of Tippy's, nobody kept score. On our last evening in Two Rivers, Imre and I offered to play a little concert at my mom's place. Carol filmed it on my phone. Imre always seems to have a very calming effect on our mother, but even Carol and Mark, who generally prefer country music, seemed enchanted. Before we left, they insisted on bringing a big box of frozen jalapeno and blue cheese brats to our motel. They made us promise to tell them how we liked them. They were delicious, all right. I later sent this picture of Imre tucking into one on my balcony. My sister tagged him in a Facebook post saying, "Great visit with my sister, and met Imre, a slightly eccentric Frenchman who loved Two Rivers." She also messaged Imre directly telling him how terrific he was. The feeling, of course, was mutual. He had to tell me about that Facebook post because, truth be told, I rarely go on there anymore. One reason among many is that I'm often traumatized by my sister's more politically oriented posts, but I was happy he showed me the one about his slight eccentricity and what a great guy he is. On these issues, I'd have to say, I agree. At the end of our stay, we took the little van back to the Milwaukee airport and found we had some time to kill. Exploring the terminal, we discovered something we hadn't noticed on our arrival, a weirdly charming and well-stocked used bookstore. As we stood, mouths agape, looking at the entrance, a middle-aged hippie came out and said, "First in-airport used bookstore in America, founded in 1979. We followed him in and discovered that they had an astonishingly good section of books dealing with French history. There was also a section of books about Wisconsin. I picked one up called Tales from Two Rivers. I figured I'd read it and then pass it along to my mom on my next visit. On our rinky-dink airplane back to New York, I read a few of the Tales from Two Rivers, anecdotes collected from older folks about their hard-scrabble lives in the early 20th century. Nell Dace Turner's testimony was titled Reminiscences Frankly Given, and indeed she didn't mince words about some of the crap women of her generation had to put up with. But Lillian Nelson Combites called her story Happiness Was Homemade. She said, "I was born in 1916, 8 months after my father's death. Mama had 5 other children under 10 years old. Isn't it great we only remember the best and happiest things most?" I'll try to recall as many as I can. Mostly, these memories seem to be the names of household cleaning products like Rub No More, with a mama elephant sitting on a wooden stool scrubbing a baby elephant in a wooden tub. Bon Amie was used as a cleanser. Neither my sister nor I had quite so hardscrabble a life as Nell or Lillian, but we did both find ourselves at similar stages in our lives, single moms just barely scraping by. Actually, so did our mom. Back in New York a couple of months later, I found myself having that conversation with Imre, trying to explain the counterintuitive business about red states and blue states. That was the night when we saw Wisconsin had gone red. And he was having a hard time reading the map anyway on account of his color blindness, so everything seemed a little hard to understand. Well, it was for me too, maybe for all of us. We hadn't seen that coming. I was asking myself what I'd been too afraid to say, but also to hear and to see. Coincidentally, just shortly after that, Imre's friend Gregory suggested they make a little video clip in 3D, which people could watch wearing those silly red and blue 3D glasses, and Imre wrote a song about color confusion. Well, we may not be able to clear up your own confusion, but we invite you to put the glasses on anyway.